Welcome back to our special series on Rui Huang's masterpiece, 1587, A Year of No Significance. In our last episode, we saw how the majestic Ming Empire began to stall under the weight of its own traditions. But history isn't just about dates. It's about the people trapped within the system. Today, in episode 6, we turn our focus to a man who tried to navigate these treacherous waters, the philosopher Li Zhi. How did one person's choices or failures shape the destiny of millions? Let's dive back into the heart of the 16th century Forbidden City.
Okay, so let's get right into it. We meet this absolutely fascinating figure, Li Zhi. He's a brilliant scholar and official, and at 61 years old, he makes a decision so shocking, it defies pretty much every convention of his time.
Now you gotta understand, this wasn't some quiet retirement. For a respected Confucian scholar to do this, it was a radical, public act of rebellion. And he had one goal: to get some intellectual and personal freedom from the incredibly rigid and frankly suffocating demands of his family and his society.
I mean, he was desperate to escape this tangled web of social obligations. You know, the constant pressure from relatives, the expectations of his class. He felt like all these things were forcing everyone, himself included, into a life of deep, soul-crushing hypocrisy. And that theme would come to define his entire life and all of his work.
So you might be asking, what exactly was this system that Li Zhi was fighting so hard against? Well, Rui Hong argues that the entire Ming Dynasty was basically crippled by a fatal flaw. It relied completely on abstract ideas about morality instead of having functional, practical laws that actually work.
And what's just so striking here is Li Zhi's brutal honesty. He saw this contradiction, this sickness everywhere. You had officials in public preaching all these Confucian virtues of selflessness and piety, while in private they were just chasing wealth and power. And the thing is, he didn't exempt himself. He pointed that finger right back at his own heart, admitting he was part of the problem. You can just imagine the toxic environment this created, right? If you were honest and pragmatic and actually tried to get things done, you were often punished because it might look messy or violate some abstract principle. But hey, if you were great at posturing and giving empty speeches, you were rewarded. It was a total trap, and it ensnared everyone, from the emperor on his throne all the way down to the local magistrate. So it's against this backdrop of just institutionalized hypocrisy that Li Zhi develops this philosophy that was so dangerously radical, it literally shook the foundations of Confucian thought. He decided he was going to use ideas as weapons.
Now, to us, that might not sound so revolutionary, but in Ming China? Whoa, that was like setting off dynamite. The state's entire power rested on its monopoly over how to interpret the Confucian classics. So Li Zhi was basically saying that every single individual had the right and the ability to read these texts for themselves. It was a direct attack on the state's control over what people were allowed to think.
And this is where things get really fascinating, because if you zoom out, you see this amazing global parallel. At the exact same time in Europe, a guy named Martin Luther was sparking the Protestant Reformation by doing something very similar, challenging the church's monopoly on the Bible. Both men were championing the individual. But here's the crucial insight. Luther's ideas ignited a revolution in a politically fragmented Europe. Li Zhi's rebellion? It was ultimately crushed by a single, unified empire that had perfected the art of ideological control. It really shows how the same spark can either start a wildfire or just get snuffed out, depending on the system it's up against. He also championed raw pragmatism over just empty piety. He made this really shocking argument. A so-called pure official, one who follows every rule but accomplishes absolutely nothing, is actually more dangerous to the state than a flawed, maybe even corrupt official who actually gets things done. For Li Zhi, results mattered way more than a perfect moral resume. And this was a full-on assault on centuries of historical judgment. He looked at figures who are condemned by traditional historians for being morally compromised, people like the powerful Empress Wu or the recently disgraced statesman Zhang Zhuzhang, and he praised them for being effective. This willingness to judge people by their real-world impact, well, it made him a true philosophical outcast. As you can probably imagine, a system that's built on conformity isn't going to tolerate a voice of such radical individualism for very long. The official backlash was inevitable, and believe me, when it came, it was absolutely brutal. The pressure just mounted over 2 decades. It started with philosophical fights with his former friends in high places. Then he becomes a monk, which alienates even more people. By the 1590s, his ideas are officially branded as heresy, and his books are ordered to be destroyed. Finally, in 1602, the system just decides it's had enough. The emperor dispatches the feared imperial guard to arrest the now aging philosopher. So an official submits this formal list of charges to the emperor, laying out the case against Li Zhi. And the accusations were this toxic mix of his philosophical crimes, like undermining Confucianism, and these scandalous, totally unproven personal attacks. He was accused of holding orgies, of luring respectable women to his monastery. I mean, it was a classic smear campaign, designed to destroy not just his ideas, but his entire character. And so we reach the end. This conflict between one stubborn, brilliant individual and the immense, inflexible machinery of the Ming state, it finally comes to its tragic climax.
When they brought him before his interrogators and asked him to defend himself against this mountain of charges, Li Zhi's response was just simple and defiant. He said that his many books were his defense, and he insisted they were beneficial, not harmful, to the true teachings of the sages. He didn't back down 1 inch.
But he knew there wasn't going to be a fair trial. He knew the verdict was already written. So, in a final, desperate act of defiance, this man who cherished his independence above all else chose to end his life on his own terms. He denied the state the satisfaction of executing him. These last words are just haunting. They reflect such a profound sense of despair, and not just for his own fate, but for the stifling, hopeless era that he lived in. It's the sound of a great mind just giving up, completely convinced that there was nothing left to hope for. And this is Rui Hong's ultimate point. Li Zhi's fate was more than just the end of one man's life. It was a clear and devastating symptom of the dynasty's terminal illness. It proved that the system had become so rigid, so brittle, that it could no longer tolerate creativity, dissent, or even the possibility of reform. In silencing Li Zhi, the empire was silencing its own chance for survival, dooming itself to an eventual collapse. Li Zhi's tragic story really forces us to ask this powerful and timeless question, not just of 16th century China, but of any society, in any time and any place. When the voices that challenge conformity are extinguished, what has a society truly lost? Thank you for joining us for this explainer.